On September 21st of 2004, Final Fantasy XI's second expansion, Chains of Papesse, was officially released. This new expansion was very difficult for many players. For years following, this expansion was seen as the pinnacle of the game's difficulty, requiring players to finish a number of brutal missions just to be able to access the expansion's endgame content. As for the endgame content itself, the C Notorious Monster system was where the most infamous Notorious Monster in the game's history was accessed, along with a plethora of challenging encounters in their own right. Even aside from the endgame content, however, multiple encounters or events in this expansion still send shivers down the spines of many who experienced the expansion back in the day, such as Promethean or the airship fight. In late 2016, over a decade after the release of Chains of Papesse, came an announcement of the third Master Trial. It was revealed that after the third and fourth expansions received the spotlight in the first two Master Trials, it would be Chains of Papesse that this new Master Trial would be based on. Sealed Fate, as it was named, would include two enemies that have a long history as super bosses in the Final Fantasy series, and that is Ultima and Omega. And in the lead up to this Master Trial's release, several groups began preparing to progress this encounter. Now, the first two Master Trials were cleared within a month of their release, give or take a few days, so there was an idea of how challenging players would expect this encounter to be. But on September 6th of 2016, players were greeted by a Master Trial whose difficulty far outranked anything in the first two encounters. Sealed Fate was far more punishing and mechanically demanding than anything players had seen up until this point. The mechanics of this encounter forced extreme coordination among all 6 members of the group due to the overlap of 3 punishing mechanics for the entire duration of the fight. All of this resulted in one of the longest progressions for the world first clear of any encounter in modern Final Fantasy XI history, having had its record broken by an encounter released as recently as February of 2024, almost 8 whole years later. So what was progression like on Sealed Fate? Upon release, a group called Two Man Cell, the group with the most momentum going into this encounter, right off the back of 2 world first clears for the first 2 Master Trials, began writing about their findings. The first thing that they noted about this encounter was that they couldn't find a way to deal damage to Omega. Its magical evasion was apparently too high for them to prioritize testing, and he had nearly 100% physical damage reduction on any incoming attacks, so they shifted their focus to Ultima instead, who had a high but manageable physical evasion with no damage reduction taken on physical damage. One very strange thing occurred just minutes into the encounter, however. Every couple seconds, these mobs would heal back to full health. No matter how much damage they tried to dish out, they found that they couldn't actually deal any damage to the mobs. Sometimes, these mobs would heal themselves with an insanely potent HP regen, and other times, Ultima would use Benediction every 30 to 60 seconds. As anticlimactic as this may sound, groups early in this encounter really struggled just finding a way to deal damage at all. And this wasn't just a brief problem that plagued Day 1 progression either. No significant progress was made on this fight till September 23, 2.5 weeks later. It's important to note that by this point in progression for both previous Master Trials, significant progress had already been made. Groups already understood the constraints the encounter was placing on them, and were already testing ways around these hurdles. But Sealed Fate wasn't like the previous Master Trials. Even the most successful pools from the top group Two Man Cell, at this point, had only gotten through about 15% of the combined HP, and they spent the last several minutes of this pool unable to make any further progress. So what were the problems everyone was running into? For starters, both Ultima and Omega have 5 million hit points each, which is a pool of hit points larger than any other Master Trial. In addition to this high HP, both enemies hit incredibly hard. If even 2 TP moves hit back to back without the proper preparations, it could result in a wipe. In addition to these TP moves, each mob was only susceptible to one type of damage. Ultima was practically invulnerable to magic damage, and Omega to physical damage. Beyond this, the 3 brutal Master Trial mechanics I already mentioned kept any progress from being made. The first of these Master Trial mechanics is what I'll call the engagement mechanic, and the way it works is it causes Ultima to use Benediction if one of the 2 mobs went undamaged for 1 whole minute. This forced players to actively be dealing damage to both mobs rather than focusing entirely on one at a time. So the way some of the early teams had attempted to deal with this mechanic is by doing minimal damage to Omega every couple seconds while burning down Ultima as quickly as possible. They had hoped to be able to kill Ultima relatively quickly, leaving only Omega to deal with. However, this strategy was completely ruled out by the second mechanic. The balance mechanic forces players to keep the HPs of both mobs relatively close together. If they fail to do this and one mob's HP is lower than the other, the mob with the higher HP gains an aura that reduces the attack power of the party for the damage type that the lower HP mob is susceptible to. So, for example, if Ultima's HP drops 5% lower than Omega's, the balance mechanic kicks in, and Omega gains a physical attack down aura, protecting Ultima from any further damage. And the greater the disparity between the mob's HPs, the stronger the aura becomes. Again, teams thought to work around this aura by separating the two mobs from each other, thereby fighting each mob outside of the aura of the other. This would divide the group into two teams, and each would have far more flexibility with how they approached the mobs. Furthermore, because of how powerful the TP moves were on these mobs, separating the two made positioning far easier, as no player was really in threat of being hit by back-to-back AoEs. So separating the mobs seemed like the silver bullet solution to everything that the early groups were having problems with. But the third mechanic completely invalidated this approach in the most brutal way possible. The third and final mechanic that was giving the early teams problems was what I'll call the division mechanic. It's a simple mechanic that kicks in the minute you get Ultima and Omega too far apart. The minute they're sufficiently separated, they gain an insanely potent regen, healing them hundreds of thousands of HP every couple seconds. This essentially means that separating the two, if one of their auras goes up from the balance mechanic, would result in them being healed back to full health in a matter of a few minutes. Now, in hindsight, it's easy to read through the early write-ups and see what problems the groups were running into. But from the perspective of these groups, the first several weeks of progression essentially boiled down to these two mobs healing back to full health every couple seconds. And if they managed to get one mob's HP down, their damage output slowly fell to 0. Early progression on this fight read like these teams were trying to break through a reinforced bolt with a rubber mallet. But once these three mechanics were discovered, progression certainly sped up, right? Unfortunately, no, it didn't speed up at all. The discovery of these early mechanics meant that groups were finally able to begin making progress in the fight, and that's exactly what the groups began doing. That is, until many groups realized that the damage output they could do was nowhere near what the encounter would require. Even the most optimized pools would only be capable of depleting a fraction of the boss's HPs in the hour allotted. The new bottleneck that players were running into after learning the mechanics was Omega. It was the mob susceptible to magic damage, but the reason it took players a long time to figure this out in the first place was because its magic evasion is so high. This essentially meant that DPS players on Ultima had to slow their pace significantly to keep the damage output balanced with the slowly functioning mages fighting Omega. Omega's magic evasion was so high, in fact, that many players were beginning to believe that there was a fourth early mechanic meant to eliminate Omega's magic evasion. So players tested relentlessly for the entire following week, looking for ways of making DPS on Omega more consistent, but ultimately they found nothing. All of this came to a head when one of the members of Two Man Cell decided to put the progression of this master trial on hold. The very best team in the world at this time had to call quits for a while. Similarly, Overlord Andy's group was radio silent for the entirety of progression, something other players correctly assumed meant that this team's progression came to a screeching halt too. It's important to remember that these groups of players were among the most well-geared and skilled groups working on this master trial. And if their progress had stopped on this encounter, it was unclear if this encounter was even possible. On October 10th, over a month after the encounter's release, the developers issued a patch to this fight. In the patch notes, it was revealed that Omega's magical evasion was decreased, as it was far higher than intended upon launch. This meant that the biggest bottleneck for the first month of the encounter was completely accidental. With this bottleneck removed, groups got to work once more trying to figure out the remainder of this encounter. But having already dedicated a whole month of very intense progression just to be told that it was accidentally overtuned must have had a huge impact on the morale of these early groups. One blog post went live on October 28 that would have huge ramifications for the remainder of progression. After being first to make it to the next phase of this encounter on their most recent pool, Two-Man Cell, the leading group responsible for almost all of the progress on this encounter, claimed that they believed the remainder of the encounter would be relatively straightforward. But to be able to meet this encounter's brutal DPS check, it would require a party composition that they simply hadn't optimized yet. This meant that progression for all the rest of the groups working on this encounter would be uncharted waters from this point on. Over the next couple weeks, players learned that this encounter could be roughly broken down into two phases. The first phase lasted between 100% and 50% of the mob's HP, and by this point, players had already come to know most of the obstacles. But phase 2 is where things get really interesting. Once the boss's HP drops below 50%, they both get certain buffs, they gain their ultimate attacks, and they also gain the ability to use 2 TP moves back to back. This essentially took everything difficult throughout the first phase and cranks it up to 11. To top this off, once Omega drops below 50%, another mechanic kicks in. The retarget mechanic causes both mobs to pick random members of the party and target them, either until the party member dies, or till the mechanic time runs out, and they return to the top player on their entity list. The retarget mechanic posed a huge problem for many players early on, as if the mobs went after the backline, they could easily decimate players with their new buffs. Furthermore, any group that immediately went into defensive stances during this retarget mechanic found that Ultima would use Benediction due to one of the two mobs not receiving any damage for the duration of the mechanic. If groups were able to survive this mechanic and recover fast enough, the slog to get through the remainder of the HP of both mobs proved too much for many groups at the time. It wouldn't be another couple months before any team was finally able to claim the first clear on this Master Trial. It was no secret by this point. This was the hardest Master Trial 11 had received. The mechanical overlap at the beginning of the encounter had made early progression borderline impossible, and the overtuning of Omega's stats for the first month didn't do anything at all to help. But after 4 months of brutal failure, 2 teams managed to clear this fight very close together in late January. So who were these winning teams? I mentioned in the black and white video that this period of 11's history was very poorly recorded. While this was certainly true for all of the early Master Trials, no World First Clear has been lost to time to the degree that Sealed Fates has. There were reports of clears of this encounter as early as December, with a strategy completely different from that of Two-Man Cell, but upon further investigation, there doesn't seem to be any record of this clear anywhere. The groups with the first confirmed clear was Kongar's group, and by all available information, it was sometime shortly before January 29th, and even this clear is difficult to learn about. The reason I can't give a definitive date is because the group was quite obscure, even at that time. The only evidence we have that this was the first clear is in the video of the world's second clear. Kongar's name is stated as having already cleared. With the help of Tojozomi, we were able to dig up some information on this team, however. It appears that this team posted information to a blog that, for whatever reason, they decided to delete not long after the clear, along with all of the evidence. So unless someone watching this video has any information that I don't, this incredible achievement by this obscure group has seemingly been lost to time. This was significant though, because this clear went to a very unlikely group of players that no one saw coming. The group went by the name Noraneko, and many of the early February clears from Japan cited their write-up as the source of their strategy. While the write-up itself is no longer accessible, there's very good reason to believe that this party composition was nearly identical to that of the world's second group. Speaking of that second clear, the group responsible was Papesse's group, and any video on Sealed Fate wouldn't be complete without a discussion on Papesse as a player. There are very few people who have consistently pushed the meta of the jobs they play on the level that Papesse has. This player is one of the most knowledgeable about the game's mechanics and execution in the entirety of the game's history. Papesse has a history of either claiming early clears on very difficult content or finding ways of clearing content so far removed from what the meta prescribed. It forces others to reconsider how static the meta for 11 truly is. Most known for finding ways of taking the summoner job through content it has no right to be in, Papesse has demonstrated the depths of Eleven's combat system time and time again, and has certainly earned a spot among the very best players in the entirety of Eleven's history. By all available evidence, the world's second clear of Sealed Fate happened very close to the first, and the group's compositions were a Rune Fencer sub-Dancer, a Summoner sub-Red Mage, a second Summoner sub-Red Mage, a Corsair sub-White Mage, a Geomancer sub-Red Mage, and finally a Black Mage sub-Scholar. Chains of Promathia has become infamous for its brutal difficulty. Certain encounters throughout the expansion had gone uncleared by many who attempted them, so it's only fitting for the Master Trial based on Chains of Promathia to stump many of the best groups in the world for months on end. The story of the early clears of this encounter will forever stand as a testament to both the monumental challenges that 11 uniquely offers players and the will of the small few who persevere in spite of these challenges. If you're wanting to experience this encounter as close as possible to the way it was upon release, I've prepared this table for you and your group. Trying to progress this fight power-locked is still among the most difficult things this game has to offer, so good luck to all of those who attempt it. As with the previous videos, this one wouldn't have been possible without Tojozomi. Thank you so much for all of the help. What were the main difficulties your group ran into when attempting this fight?
I would say the main problem that we ran into was hate management. How most people did the fight at the time is that so the setup was Rune Fencer, Corsair, Black Mage, Geo, Summoner, Summoner. And most people were doing that setup. We chose the same setup. Quite often, I believe having the Rune Fencer open the skill chain for the Corsair, so it would be like Ground Strike to Leaden to make Darkness, and then the Black Mage would burst Death, and then that would be on Omega. And then on Ultima, you would just have the two summoners swapping between Garuda for Predator Claws and Kate Sith for Mewing Lullaby. I think that's how most people approach that fight. We found that our Corsair was frequently pulling hate pretty early in the fight, doing that, closing those skill chains. What we tried to do was find a way to get the Corsair to open the skill chain instead of closing it, so that they're doing a lot less damage and more of the damage ends up on the Black Mage. We found that to be extremely helpful for keeping our Corsair alive for the whole run. And the other thing that we noticed that kind of enabled this strat is that Ultima was going down pretty fast. With two summoners, we had more than enough damage, and in fact, in some cases, we're having to wait. Especially, like I said, if the Corsair pulls hate and dies, the damage on Omega is going to slow down. We ended up switching one of our summoners over to Omega, and so we had one summoner doing Predator Claws with just Garuda. One summoner was just Garuda full time doing Predator Claws, and the other summoner was Kate Sith full time. And they would do Mewing Lullaby, as well as using, I believe it was Regal Gash to close. So the Corsair would do Leaden Salute, and the Kate Sith would do Regal Gash to close Darkness, and the Black Mage would burst that. And that let our Corsair keep hate low and fixed a lot of our problems. So hate management was definitely the big issue there on that fight. And even with that, there's still a very interesting phase right around 49% that I will probably talk about later. But once we changed the skill chain order around, I think that was kind of the key that turned our fights really smooth and let us win.
You talked about the enmity and I guess some of the difficulties keeping hate. I do know that the enmity system in this particular encounter isn't what a lot of modern players are experiencing with the content today. Could you explain a little bit about the differences between like enmity mechanics back then?
My memory's a little rusty on this, so I could be wrong, but I believe that the old enmity system had damage dealt, in particular like physical damage from attacks and melees and weapon skills, generated quite a lot more enmity, as well as cures at the time. Also, healing generated a lot more enmity back then than it does now. You'll almost never pull hate with cures these days, but it was very commonplace back in the day, to the point that this is kind of a throwback, but back then paladins would often have a swap to reduce their HP so that they could then cure themselves back up and generate hate. These days, that would just be a total waste of time. But back then, it was actually worth doing. So I think those are kind of the key differences. And ultimately, as gear got stronger in the 99 era, people were able to deal so much more damage that tanks just couldn't keep up with hate generation anymore. And I think that's why they changed the system. Now, that said, magic damage has always generated less hate than physical. So in this particular fight, I don't really think that oddity causes as much problem as people might expect, even if they know the difference between the two hate systems. Almost all the damage to Omega is magic, and Ultima Garuda is going to pull hate on Ultima sometimes, and you just have to resummon her because you don't want Ultima attacking Garuda. You want him attacking the tank so that it doesn't get as much TP. Tanks over there spamming Stone Skin and whatnot to try to prevent TP gains. So that's really the only effect I think that comes out of that little quirk is that Garuda has to be resummoned. And even that doesn't impact most groups because, like I said, most groups had their summoners alternating between Kate and Garuda. So they're already resummoning Garuda anyway, except during Astral Conduit. So even that bit doesn't affect them. It did affect us though, because like I said, I was the guy doing Garuda and we had another guy on Kate Sith. So I did have to resummon Garuda from time to time just because I was leaving it out to build up Avatar's favor and get me faster blood packs than I would be able to if I was swapping back and forth.
You had touched on a second ago. You said that there are kind of different phases of the fight. Could you give us some high level sequencing, kind of the different phases and things that you need to pay attention to in this particular encounter?
Mostly what I was referring to is at 49% when he does stand up, he has this weird sort of a hate reset. And I say it's weird because it's not like he exactly loses his hate from what I remember. It's more like he just kind of picks one person in the party to ruin their day. I believe a few times we had when if he would pick the scholar or something, we were able to keep them alive, and after 30 seconds or so, he will eventually go back to normal hate. But most of the time, what it ended up being is he would just pick someone and kill them, and then
And it
he'd go
was
back to
never
the
the
tank.
tank, right? He always
Correct.
shifted off of the tank. Okay.
Yeah, I
Interesting.
don't recall him ever like just staying on the tank. It always seems to be someone else. But we've never had him change either, after he does that. So, like, there are some fights, and I'm struggling to think of a specific example. There are some modern fights where the NM during certain times will start ignoring the top person on the hate list and just go for the second person on the hate list, right? I don't think this was that because we never saw him change. Once he picks someone, that's the guy.
Was there a particular person in the party that if he picked, it was more or less almost an immediate wipe or like an additional 10 minutes or something like that? Like one
The
particular
Corsair.
worst case? Okay, the
I would say the
Corsair.
Corsair almost certainly. The Black Mage struggles if they get weakened because their death is going to be obviously a lot worse. Um, but they can, keep putting out a little bit of damage. Whereas the Corsair, if they're weakened, it really impacts the skill chains. So yeah, definitely the Corsair, and of course, the Corsair was almost always the person who got picked too.
Yeah, I should say. So, from the very first attempt that your group had on this fight till the time you cleared, how long did that take?
I actually checked just so that I would know. It was about 2 weeks. We weren't playing every day, but we were playing pretty steadily. Yeah, and like I said, most of that was just working out the hate management. We had both of our summoners and our rune fencer were experienced in TP drain fights, like with Aeon from Aeonix, doing Aranis and the Sandworm and Aeonix and whatnot. So we kind of knew the score, and it was just about figuring out what can go wrong in the run and how can we prevent it. And once we got that, the fight was pretty smooth.
What strategy did you guys follow? I know you mentioned one earlier, but was it one that Papesse, I think?
I actually don't know how to pronounce their name either. I always assumed it was Papesse, but I don't know. But yes, I believe it was their strategy originally. Like I said, we made a few changes around the skill chain, but I believe that the composition we got of Rune Core, Black Mage, Summoner, Geo, I believe was their composition. Like I said, we just made a few changes to it is all.
At the time, did you guys have to grind out a lot of gear to be able to imitate that strategy, or did you pretty much have everything that you needed to the minute you guys decided to start prog?
No, we pretty much had it. We were fortunate. Like I said, I've always been a summoner aficionado, and we had a few others in my orbit as well as a result. And also the Aeonics. This is something that I think that a lot of people don't realize. When Aeonics were first being cleared, it wasn't actually Summoner Burn that was the first way people did it. It was Magic Burst. It was almost all done with Magic Burst. Even the Race and Jima Helm NMs, like Shaw and whatnot, it was all just done with Scholar and Black Mage Magic Bursts. So we had geared up Black Mages as a result of that as well. So we kind of just had all the pieces already, fortunately, and we were able to just put them together and make it work.
Did you have a static at this time, or did you kind of have to put that party together for that fight?
We kind of formed a loose static for all three of the Master Trials around roughly the same time. This is 2017, and the strategy had kind of mostly been worked out for all three at this point, and we decided, let's go get those cosmetics. I think there may have been a few members that changed out for one versus the other, but I think there was like at least 4 or so people that were static throughout all 3 master trials.
Speaking of you guys' actual run, what particular mechanics, what particular attributes of the fight did you find interesting? Just kind of walk us through your experience with the fight, all of the noteworthy aspects of it.
The fight is mechanically, it's very simple. Every 20 seconds you do a mewing lullaby. Every time the Corsair has TP, you do a skill chain, and the Black Mage, bursts whatever they can, Death or Comet, whatever's up. The Rin Fencer, if they've got Gambit and Rake, sweet, use them. Otherwise, they're chilling and generating enmity. Like the whole thing is pretty straightforward. The only real wrinkle, like I said, comes at that 49% when things get a little bit crazy, and that's when you have to adapt a little bit. Once you recover from that, things kind of just go back to normal, and you're back to just TP draining, skill chaining, magic bursting. Honestly, like I said, it's mechanically it's a very simple fight.
It's interesting that you mentioned that too, because it took the longest for any group to clear. If memory serves, Black and White, it took about 1 month before the first Japanese group cleared, first in the world. Unafraid of the Dark, it's unclear who was first on that. It was either Overlord Andy or that same Japanese group on Black and White. Sealed Fate came out, and I know that a lot of people said it was impossible for like the first month because of the magic evasion on Omega, if memory serves, but it took about 3 or 4 months before anyone was able to clear that fight.
That does not surprise me at all. And again, I think that goes back to the reason that I brought up Sealed Fate as when you asked, which you think are the most challenging. Even though I called Sealed Fate probably the simplest to execute mechanically, it's also it has the least room for error. Any mistakes
Interesting.
can really just mess up the run. And so if your strategy is not really dialed in, the fight goes from mechanically fairly simple to just straight up impossible. And so that's why I think we saw that where people were struggling to find a strategy that works, and took quite a bit longer, because it's kind of like the 2 master trials that people are beating their heads against right now, the one that was just cleared and the one that hasn't been cleared. People know there has to be a trick to this. There's some idea that hasn't quite been figured out that is gonna turn this from being impossible to possible, like the Theodore kiting trick that they figured out for the August Master Trial. There's going to be something like that. And I think likely for Ultima and Omega, setting up just the right party composition so you can TP drain while dealing physical to Ultima and magical to Omega. Once you get that composition and figure out what's going to work, it all just fits. In hindsight being 2020, it all seems kind of obvious. But early on, I am not surprised at all that there was a great deal of struggle with that one, because the TP moves are super deadly compared to the other 2.
There were a couple interesting mechanics in this fight. One was that you had to keep both mobs relatively balanced, and the other is you had to keep both mobs relatively close together. Could you walk us through what both of those mechanics are?
Yeah, sure. So the keeping them separated thing, I can't actually speak too much on, because that had been discovered and was known at the time, so we just kept them together. We didn't even try separating them. We just kept them together the whole time. That's just, we acknowledge that you can't split them apart. The keeping the damage up is definitely something that can present a problem. You would think it would be pretty straightforward to like, oh yeah, just don't let 60 seconds pass without dealing any damage, right? That seems kind of obvious. Why would you just stand there for 60 seconds? But like I said, around 49%, things get a little bit hectic. Suddenly he picks a new target to start smashing on. Making skill chains becomes very difficult, because the Corsair is probably running around like a chicken with his head cut off, because Omega's probably trying to kill him. Maybe the Black Mage is. And so really during that time, we found was the most common time that we would slip. And I think we had at least 1 or 2 benedictions just while we were trying to stay alive through that phase.
It's interesting that that particular mechanic was, I guess, first put in this because a very, very similar mechanic was borrowed for DSR in Final Fantasy XIV. I'm not sure if you keep up with the Ultimate raids, but in one of the phases of Dragon's Song Reprise, the 4th Ultimate, if memory serves, you have to keep the Dragon's HP relatively close, and I believe if you don't, they wind up enraging and just killing everyone. It's interesting to hear that this served as kind of like a first trial run, so to speak, for that.
Speaking of interesting. Which, so that came after this master trial, then?
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I think it's definitely a cool mechanic. They definitely haven't used much else that I'm aware of. It forces you to be aware of not just what you're doing, but what the whole party is doing, and I kind of like that.
It's unfortunate that not more people are testing Wing of War, because a lot of the groups who I talked to who are working on Oathsworn Blade are still working on Oathsworn Blade. They haven't moved on to Wing of War since Big Timer's group cleared, but it seems a lot like there's a trick very similar to that for Chaos and Bahamut in Wing of War. Chaos benedictions if you wind up trying to kill him first. And then Bahamut, he gains, I think, a 99% DT, if maybe a little bit less, but it's really, really difficult to do damage to him. So it's funny because in DSR it's 2 dragons, and it's very, very similar in Wing of War. I'm just curious what that mechanic will turn out to be. It does feel like it will be a modified version of what's in Sealed Fate, though.
Well, that is interesting that you bring up the the dragon connection with the 14 fight. That is very interesting. I would not be surprised if it ends up being something like that. I think it's quite clear that melee is out. It's not going to, whatever the strat is, it's not going to be melees.
I'm just curious to see how it goes. It's funny because the divide between the people who are working on these fights and the people who are observing it is crazy. Because, in the community, there's a lot of lethargy when it comes to these master trials. Yeah. But then when you start talking to players working on it, it's like all of them are just really, really dedicated, and no one's talking about it publicly. So it's really, I guess, kind of crazy seeing that world from both the inside and the out,
Well, it is definitely very interesting, and that's part of the reason why I find these videos and conversations you're having very interesting. There's the community in Final Fantasy XI. It used to feel a lot smaller than it does now, if that makes any sense. I think in large part it's because people in the older game, they used to have to team up for everything. This is very much a more solo accessible game now. They've got trusts and whatnot, so you can solo almost everything in this game at this point. It didn't used to be like that, and people had to work together. So if there was an active player on your server that was actually doing stuff, it was very likely you were going to run into them and interact with them at some point. I think it led to a community where people were more aware of what other people on the server were doing at various times. If there's a group that's trying to clear a master trial, or a group that's trying to kill animated weapons or something, you would hear about it just through the grapevine, and it made a sense of community. Like you would hear, oh yeah, there's people on my server that are doing this really tough content. These days, it's harder to keep apprised of that kind of thing because a lot of people are just kind of playing, on an island. They don't really interact with each other as much. So I wanted to take a chance to thank you for doing some of this stuff, because I do feel like it kind of restores a little bit of that small world feeling where what's going on. It's cool to hear about these things that are happening that we might not otherwise hear about.
Yeah, well, definitely. It's my pleasure. One really cool thing about this, too, is it's not just 11 players that seem to find it interesting. Ultimate Raiders in Final Fantasy XIV are, reaching out and asking me about, what the experience is gearing for the older Master Trials versus the new. So it's funny because a lot of people in 11 seem to look at the Master Trials like weird, secluded side content, but then the minute people start talking about what's actually going on, everyone seems to find it really interesting,
Yeah, I think that's probably the nature of challenging content, that a lot of people, see as out of their reach probably. And well, I don't know, it's probably a combination of being out of their reach and just not being a priority because it's, purely cosmetic rewards, right? A lot of people just have stuff they'd probably rather be working on that makes, they feel makes them stronger.
That's true. And it's funny, I was talking to a player, I think it was maybe last week or the week before. A lot of the people that he knows, and my experience has been exactly the same, a lot of the people who are working on these master trials, they see these as opportunities to just hang out with their friends. And it'd be really cool if their friend group could get world first or clear a master trial first on their server. But I mean, a lot of the people doing this, they might want to work on other gear, and sometimes they take breaks to do that, but it's just hanging out with their friends is why they're doing any of this content in the first place.
Absolutely. So, I think that's probably a common thread for a lot of the people who have been playing the game for a long time. It's been out for over 2 decades. So people, for the most part, have had a chance to do most of the mainline stuff that they want to do. Maybe there's always more jobs that they can level in gear, but yeah, I think a lot of people are reaching that point where they feel accomplished. They're more willing to spend their time doing obscure things.
This was a ton of fun. Thank you so much for coming on here. If there's anything else, if I do another series that requires someone with experience in the game, I'd love to have another one of these conversations.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I've been active through all phases of the game, so I've got stories and stories and stories, so I appreciate the opportunity.
Definitely. You have a good day.
All right, thanks. You too.